Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting me. My name is Darryl Jones, and I'm interested in horror. And I did indeed spend far too much of my young life, and probably far too much of my middle-aged life as well, reading and watching horror. And one of the things that those of us who are interested in horror as scholars like myself, as practitioners or as fans, often find ourselves having to do is to defend our chosen or beloved area of interests. Defend it against those who think that somehow an interest in horror is suspicious, is bad for you, that anybody who is too interested in watching horror movies must be a sick person in search of ideas. And I've noticed people in the past sort of backing away from me when I tell them what I'm interested in, what I work on. So one of the reasons I wrote this book is as not a defense of horror, because I don't really think it needs defending as such. I don't feel defensive about it, but as an explanation of the enduring and continuing appeal of horror, of its centrality to culture, that civilization is inconceivable without some idea of horror, that many of our religious rituals and religions are founded on ideas which resemble in their interest in blood sacrifice, for example, in torture, in cannibalism, in subjects which we would recognize from watching and reading horror. It's part of what we are. It's part of what we do. It's also, and this is what I want to talk about today, an explanatory mechanism for the world in which we live. It helps us think through the world. It's a response to the world, particularly its anxieties, the anxieties of a given culture at a given time. So these are some of the things that I want to talk about today. Just a quick show of hands. Do we have any horror fans in the congregation? First of all, all right, a small amount. Do we have any people in the audience that find horror difficult and are either, well, frightened, that's the point, I suppose, or repulsed by it? We have a couple at least. Okay, I want to try and convince you, if not that you've been wrong all along, I want to try and convince you at least that I haven't been wrong all along. So, this is a talk then called Horror Today, and it arises out of the book, and it's a part of the last section of the book with some further extrapolation. So the talk is divided into two parts, and in the first part I want to look in general terms at the location of horror today, at least where I think it is, where we are, and end with a few pointers to the future, a very dangerous and very rash thing to do. And in the second part, I want to look at one particular subgenre, which is climate change horror, eco-horror. This is horror at its most urgent and its most relevant, if, as I believe, we look to horror can tell us things about the world in which we live, is a means of interpreting the world in which we live. We would expect, given that this is our major contemporary anxiety, I believe, we would expect there to be quite a lot of eco-horror. So it offers, for me, a powerful contemporary example of the importance of horror as a means of approaching contemporary anxieties, and more generally, I think, as a way of asking serious intellectual and political questions. So another thing I believe is that horror is, as well as being a visceral medium, it is also an intellectual one. So where is horror today? This is the first part of my talk. The location of horror, I think, moves with culture. We may be seeing signs, we are seeing signs that it is moving with geopolitics away from an American axis. Important Hispanic horror, important Asian horror in this century. It may also be that in my, at least, concentration on horror as traditional media, fiction and film, that we may not be looking, if we're not looking in the wrong places, we might not be looking in all the right places either. A viewer of mainstream Hollywood cinema in the early 21st century might well have concluded that the genre in this manifestation at least was creatively moribund, dead or undead. Cinematically, the US film industry appeared content to allow younger directors to plunder its back catalogue of horror films in what seems like an endless recycle of sequels, remakes, and reboots. A corporate production line of horror, a wasteland. And most particularly, American cinematic horror revisited landmark films of the 1970s. And the 70s does seem to be the key decade for American horror. In a 2016 Time Out experts poll of the 100 best horror films, 6 of the top 10 films were from the 1970s, and a further 3 were from 1968, 1980, and 1982. 68 was Rosemary's Baby, 80 was The Shining, 82 was The Thing. So around the 70s. The only one outside of that orbit, I suppose, was from the early 60s, was Psycho. But apart from that, the top 10 was in a sort of long 1970s. So there were, for example, there have been in this century, for example, remakes of The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, remade in 2003 with subsequent sequels as well. Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes, originally from 1977, remade in 2006. Carrie, 1976, the great Brian De Palma movie, remade in 2013. This one starring people you've actually heard of, Chloe Grace Moretz, Julianne Moore, and others. And even, unbelievably to me at least, 2 of the most notorious films in the ultra-controversial rape-revenge cycle of the 1970s, Wes Craven's Last House on the Left. Keep telling yourself it's only a movie. The first came out in 1972, remade in 2009. This is Gaylord St. James, the star of Last House on the Left in 1972. I just put him in there because I want to draw your attention to the fact that there is an actor out there called Gaylord St. James. So Gaylord St. James, everybody. So there's Last House on the Left, and even I Spit on Your Grave, originally from 1978, remade in 2010. Now, some of these 1970s films in and around their original release, and I think particularly Last House on the Left, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I Spit on Your Grave, were viewed as genuinely dangerous cultural artifacts, drawing the horrified gaze of legislators, judges, censors, cultural commentators, and the media. They were banned. These were amongst the original video nasties banned by the Video Recordings Act of the 1980s on the grounds that simply viewing these films could incite viewers to go and commit acts of violence. Now, horror has always had an uneasy relationship, and sometimes quite a creative relationship, with censors. And I would regret, and I think many people would regret, if that relationship wasn't there, because there is a creative edginess to it. And the history of horror has always also been the history of outraged responses to horror. Won't somebody think of the children? You know? But the point that I want to make now with these remakes of the 21st century, their post-millennial counterparts tend to come and go unnoticed because they don't matter. And we've lost something. We've really lost something. What have we got instead in terms of American horror? Well, Oren Peli's Paranormal Activity from 2007, which many of you will have seen, I'm sure, was the most successful horror film, American horror film of the 21st century, if not of all time, until the release of it last year. In profit to budget terms, in fact, Paranormal Activity may be the most successful movie ever released. And viewed in isolation, this film is an exemplar of post-millennial kind of un-horrific horror. It relies firstly on a found footage technique, which following the success of the Blair Witch Project in 1999 has been overused in horror films to the point of cliche. And Blair Witch itself, I should note, although undeniably brilliant, had adapted its own found footage technique from the Great Cannibal Holocaust, the most notorious of all the video nasties. Paranormal Activity began a self-recycling franchise, which has produced six films to date. And there's nothing distinctively contemporary about this, nor is it inherently problematic. There's the element of repetition, of seeing the same thing over and over again, is an important aspect of the pleasure we get from watching horror. You know, one of the points I've made before is that nobody, and I mean nobody, went to see Friday the 13th Part 9 or Saw 6, expecting a completely different cinematic experience from the one they got when they went to see Friday the 13th Part 8 or Saw 5. What people want is to see the same thing, but slightly different. And the notion of a cinematic horror franchise goes back at least as far as Universal horror in the 1930s, but viewed in the context of a horror cinema which seems to have run out of ideas, this repetition may be just another sign of creative bankruptcy. And Paranormal Activity is also the foremost modern exponent of the cinematic technique which is most characteristic of post-millennial American horror, the jump shock or jump scare, long periods of silence, tense silence punctuated by loud noises, what the film critic Mark Kermode has termed the quiet bang technique, and sometimes known in cinematic parlance, in fact, as the bus, in honor of a celebrated film scene in the 1941 Val Lewton Jacques Tourneur Cat People, in which a scene of great tension is broken by the loud hiss of a bus's brakes. Now, the jump shock is undeniably effective, but as a dominant technique, it's not horror or terror in the way that these terms have come to be understood. Anyone can sneak up behind you, shout "boo" very loudly, and make you drop your ice cream. But this says nothing about the state of your soul, your place in the universe, the social function of violence, the evils of political inequality, nor any of the other serious questions that horror is accustomed to asking. So we shouldn't be looking in American cinema, but we might want to look in Asian cinema. We shouldn't be looking primarily in mainstream American cinema. But there are other places to look, and here obviously is one of them. When it was released in 1992, Fran Rubel Kuzui's film Buffy the Vampire Slayer received mixed reviews and passed without much notice. Unsatisfied with both the film and its reception, its writer Joss Whedon tried again, adapting it for television. The first episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer was broadcast on March the 10th, 1997. Can it really be that long ago? 21 years ago. With Sarah Michelle Gellar, there she is, of course, an authentic 90s scream queen in the title role. In that very same year, 97, she also appeared in the neo-slasher films I Know What You Did Last Summer and Scream 2. So looking back from the perspective of 21 years, it's tempting to view this moment as marking a tectonic shift in American horror. Playing over 7 seasons from 1997 to 2003, Buffy developed into a work and a world of considerable complexity, intelligence and imagination, the very antithesis of the risk-averse, compromised, moribund condition of much mainstream American cinematic horror around the millennium, which seemed incapable of ever surprising its audience or delighting them. Buffy, of course, also came into being with the internet, and so its success was partly augmented by the rise of the blogosphere and by the online culture of fandom. It also captured the academic imagination. The subdiscipline of Buffy studies, combining institutional academic criticism and theory with fandom and unlicensed criticism in the public sphere, has produced a small library of often very sophisticated cultural and textual analysis. Buffy was one of the early signs that the millennial generation was experiencing what is often characterized as a or the golden age of television. Capital G, capital A, capital T. From The Sopranos, 1999 to 2007, to The Wire, 2002 to 2008, to Breaking Bad, 2008 to 13, to Game of Thrones, 2011 to 18. The medium television has shed much of its cultural inferiority complex relative to film. First broadcast in 2013, Hannibal took the continuing story of our great modern demon to creative heights seemingly foreclosed to film after Brett Ratner's unforgivably lumpen 2002 adaptation of Red Dragon. With seasons entitled Murder House, Asylum, Coven, Freak Show, Hotel, Roanoke, Cult, and others, American Horror Story, first broadcast in 2011, engages with the satisfyingly familiar tropes and locations of horror. We like it because we know it. The Louisiana set first season of True Detective, 2014, drew explicitly on the history of American weird fiction, most particularly with its references to the lost land of Carcosa, originally to be found in Robert W. Chambers' book The King in Yellow and in the works of Ambrose Bierce. However, from a historical perspective, this golden age of television might come to be viewed as a lost gasp. It's a product of a moment in which the dominant cultural medium of the second half of the 20th century, television, began to be subsumed within the dominant cultural medium of the 21st, the internet. So what might authentic internet horror look like? This might be a place to look for horror today. Well, one place to look, for example, might be in podcasts, such as the hugely enjoyable fake radio show, Welcome to Night Vale, or the riotously inventive Down Below the Reservoir. But the brilliance of these podcasts rests on the actually rather 20th century notion that they are produced and controlled by highly creative auteurs. Joseph Kink and Jeffrey Craner for Night Vale, Graham Tugwell for Reservoir. Another distinctive internet product, meme culture, has the potential to be altogether more decentered and anarchic, and it may be uncontrollable. And here's one example, a famous one. On June the 10th, 2009, as many of you will, I know, be aware, a pair of photoshopped images appeared on Something Awful, a comedy website and online forum. Credited to Victor Surge, the photographs showed 2 groups of children, photographed in black and white. In the background, blurred and indistinct, was a tall figure dressed in black and seemingly with tentacles for arms. This was, of course, the Slender Man. And beneath the images were these captions. Beneath the image on your left here, we didn't want to go. We didn't want to kill them. But its persistent silence and outstretched arms comforted us and surrounded us at the same time. And for the image on the right, one of two recovered photographs from the Stirling City Library blaze, notable for being taken the day which 14 children vanished, and for what is referred to as the Slender Man. Deformities cited as film defects by originals. Fire at library occurred 1 week later. Actual photograph confiscated as evidence. 1986, photographer Mary Thomas, missing since June 13th, 1986. And you can just see the figure in the back of both photographs there. Lacking any kind of central controlling narrative beyond a vague but palpable sense of menace and threat, particularly to children, the Slender Man took on a life of its own as a self-replicating, evolving internet meme, recurring first in user-generated creepypasta online fiction and arts, and in YouTube videos, video games, and more generally as an elusive cultural referent. On May the 31st, 2014, as you may well know, two 12-year-old girls from Wisconsin stabbed a classmate 19 times after a night reading online Slender Man creepypasta. They did this, they said, in order to become the Slender Man's servants, to become his proxies. Fears, real fears, that the Slender Man seems capable of infecting reality and of transforming it, have led to the most recent of horror's ongoing series of moral panics. The case went to trial in September 2017, and the defense attorney claimed that the girls, and I quote, swirled down into madness together. The defendants, Morgan Giza and Anita Wire, were sentenced to 40 years and 25 years respectively in mental hospitals, the maximum sentences possible for their respective crimes. So it falls on each generation then to create its own monsters, or at least its own unique iterations of monstrosity. There's a good reason why vampires cast no reflections in the mirror. It's because what looks back at us is ourselves. We invest in monsters, our own anxieties, but sometimes also our own desires, inarticulable in respectable social discourse. Monsters body forth our dreams and our nightmares. Now, the internet is too vast and too fast for a talk of this length, or for a book of any size. It's given horror an infinite library in which to play, an endless labyrinth in which to hide. The Slender Man is its most distinctive monster thus far. He's the scariest thing in ages, but there will be others. Part 2. The world is dying. It's our fault. And unless we take radical action now, it will be too late to do anything about it. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, produced this month, a couple of weeks ago, made for terrifying reading. We are looking into an apocalyptic future of blistering summers, melting ice caps, drowned cities, whole portions of the planet left effectively uninhabitable, the death of coral, the decimation of insect life, dramatic resource scarcity, unprecedented political upheaval, Population migration on a scale we've never seen before. Food and water wars. The potential breakdown of any social order. Increasingly, many of us have the sense that we're living through a horror movie. The Walking Dead are everywhere, on our screens and at our ports, on our streets and in our homes. There's a widespread sense of helplessness, a wholesale lack of agency. Horror, in fact, is a cultural mode, as I've suggested, uniquely suited to articulating popular anxieties in an understandable form. And these are uniquely anxious times. Those of us who watch and read horror know that it is not escapism for sickos, as I suggested, but an urgent explanatory mechanism for the world around us. President Donald Trump's decision in 2017 to withdraw America from the Paris Agreement on climate change action followed a sustained campaign of climate change denial by the American right, which brought together the economic interests of certain parts of corporate America with the cultural anti-modernity of the evangelical religious right. While some media outlets, such as the BBC, have worked hard in a way which has often been terribly self-damaging to maintain a balanced view, the response to global warming in horror fiction, film, and television over the past 2 decades has been virtually univocal. Climate change is real. The Earth is warming. This is a man-made disaster. Our survival is under severe threat. Thus, for example, in M. Night Shyamalan's The Happening in 2008, plants begin to release toxins which are deadly to humanity. Construction worker Curtis, played by Michael Shannon, begins to have apocalyptic visions of a coming storm which will decimate humanity in Jeff Nichols' Take Shelter from 2011. And the film closes with drops of black rain. It may be oil, it may be something altogether more uncanny, falling from the sky. Steroid-laden excrement dumped into Chesapeake Bay from an industrial chicken rearing plant creates a mutated strain of flesh-eating parasites in Barry Levinson's genuinely disturbing The Bay from 2012. And the film is an extrapolation of real-life environmental concerns that manure runoff from intensive poultry farms was contributing to a number of ecological dead zones in Chesapeake Bay. In Jeff Vandermeer's novel Annihilation from 2014, a team of scientists investigates the mysterious Area X, a sealed-off area of unknowable nature. Vandermeer's novel has been compared to the work of the great American ruralist, philosophical ruralist, Henry David Thoreau, whose 1851 book Walden is the great American literary meditation on the relationship between humanity and the natural world. Given widespread anxieties about the melting of the polar ice caps, it's not surprising that the 21st century has produced a good deal of Arctic and Antarctic horror. Polar Gothic is a recurring subgenre of horror, drawing on the long unexplored and thus fundamentally imaginary geography of the polar regions. A number of works of horror and also of fantasy have been set in the far northern and far southern latitudes. The narration of Frankenstein, celebrating its 200th anniversary this year, takes place on board the ship of the polar explorer Robert Walton. At the close of the novel, Victor Frankenstein heads out onto the ice towards the pole in pursuit of his monster. Edgar Allan Poe's only novel, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, follows its protagonist on his inexorable journey south towards its Antarctic climax. Fresh out of medical school, Arthur Conan Doyle served for a time as a ship's doctor on a Greenland whaling voyage. His story, The Captain of the Pole Star, is an imaginative response to this voyage. Heavily influenced by Poe, H.P. Lovecraft's great novella, At the Mountains of Madness, charts the terrifying discoveries of an Antarctic expedition. All three film versions of The Thing, 1951 there in the middle, 1982, 2011, so another contemporary remake, based on John W. Campbell's 1938 novella, Who Goes There?, are set in polar latitudes. Antarctica in 1938, 1982 and 2011, Northern Alaska in 1951. So polar horror then is not a new phenomenon, but it has gained exponentially in intensity in the last decades. Roland Emmerich's The Day After Tomorrow opens in the Antarctic, where a slice of the ice shelf, quote, the size of Rhode Island, breaks off due to global warming, a harbinger of the climatic disaster to follow, in which the northern USA becomes uninhabitable and Mexico gives shelter to American refugees. This was the film which spurred former Vice President Al Gore to make his own influential climate change documentary film, An Inconvenient Truth, in 2006. And in 2017, a slice of the Antarctic Larsen Sea ice shelf did break off. It was larger than Delaware, which is half as big again as Rhode Island. So we've outdistanced our fantasy already in 10 years. In Larry Fessenden's film The Last Winter from 2006, an eco-horror reimagining of Algernon Blackwood's classic work of Canadian horror, The Wendigo. In The Last Winter, the melting of the permafrost releases supernatural entities, first into a remote oil drilling camp on the northern slope of Alaska, and then, it is implied, worldwide. When Abby, played by Connie Sellers, the camp's only survivor, wakes up in hospital, she hears news reports about a widespread disaster. A doctor in the room next door has hanged himself. Stepping outside, she walks through puddles of water. The snow has melted. The hospital in which Abby wakes at the end of the last winter is presumably in Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost city in the US. Barrow's isolation, cut off from the world for long periods, is what makes it vulnerable to a vampire attack in 30 Days of Night in 2007. The last winter's trope of the melting polar ice releasing forces inimical to humanity recurs in The Thaw, 2009, with Val Kilmer as a climate scientist. The world is safe with Val Kilmer as a climate scientist. And also in the TV series Fortitude, 2015. Fortitude was set in the Svalbard archipelago, the northernmost inhabited place in the world. And Svalbard is also the setting for parts of Philip Pullman's young adult fantasy, Northern Lights in 1995, and for Michel Paver's remarkable retro ghost story, Dark Matter in 2010. And there's me in Svalbard last year. Svalbard is also the home of the global seed vault, protected there in the permafrost, in case we ever need to reseed the planet in the wake of an environmental catastrophe. In 2016, unusually high temperatures, those same ones that are causing the ice caps to melt around Svalbard, caused a flood of meltwater into the vault's tunnels. Meanwhile, back at home, on our screens, in Game of Thrones, the Night King and his zombie army sweep down from the frozen north, marching relentlessly towards the ice wall that has kept them at bay for millennia and threatening to wipe out humanity. At the end of the last episode, as many of you, I'm sure, will know, an undead dragon laid waste to the wall. We are all holding our breath to see what happens next. you very much.
It was excellent, thank you. I think we have some time for questions, about 20 minutes. If you'd like to ask a question, just pop your hand up. I'll come around, give you a microphone.
You know, maybe it's just me, but I've noticed that lately there's been a trend in horror to go for the more atmospheric kind of horror. So, you know, I'm thinking of movies like Hush, the adaptation of Gerald's Game, and most notably, I think, The Haunting of Hill House, which was absolutely incredible.
Don't tell me about it, because I haven't watched it yet.
You should. It's incredible. But yeah, anyway, so I was wondering, where do you think this comes from, this shift towards atmospheric horror rather than gore?
Yeah. And I would say it's there in fiction as well. The old-fashioned ghost story is back. There was a time, maybe a decade ago, when the horror sections had pretty much disappeared from Waterstones and other commercial bookstores, but now they're back, and old-fashioned ghost stories have made a real comeback. And you're absolutely right that this is something that relies on the creation of an unsettling mood or atmosphere. And there's a couple of things to say about this. I think the first thing to say is I think we've realised that the jump shock, first of all, is overdone. It's a dead end. It's, you know, it has nothing. There's no surprise left in that one. Ultra-violence and gore is many things, but it's not generally scary. It's shocking, it's sometimes funny, but it's rarely frightening. I think the supernatural tale, and, you know, although I've been saving Hill House, in fact, for the time when I have a spare few days, but I certainly know Shirley Jackson's original novel very well, and you know, these are tried and tested narratives. We know they work. We know they work in a strangely old-fashioned way, because this sense of the uncanny, of feeling not at home with ourselves, of not knowing whether the foundations on which we base our perceptions are real or not. This is unsettling and thus frightening. And I think one of the things we're doing is rediscovering our sense of this kind of unsettling fear. So I think that's what it is, that it works.
So climate change is announcing itself for a while, so there has been some time to adapt this for horror. Do you see any other trends in horror that are based on the current developments in the world?
Yes, I do. There's quite a few of them. We've seen an interesting and very kind of pointed development of particularly American horror arising out of racial tensions and inequality, from Get Out to Detroit. And Detroit is definitely a horror film. I don't know whether you've seen it. I mean, it's a Catherine Bigelow film, and Catherine Bigelow is used to mixing different kinds of modes and genres in her film. As anybody who's ever seen Point Break will know, you know, what kind of film is it? And so Detroit is partly a historical drama, partly a cop movie, but very largely a horror film. I think a kind of home invasion horror film. So there's there's a new strain of American racial horror, I suppose we would call it. The most obvious one to me is, and again, this is going over the last decade or so, since the global financial crash of a decade ago. It's no accident, I don't think, that we have seen a resurgence of interest in zombie culture. You know, what are zombies? They're a mindless, undifferentiated lumpen proletarian mass, completely without any kind of control or agency over their own lives. They're completely powerless, and many of us have felt that way in the wake of the financial crisis, that we are enthralled to powers beyond our comprehension, of which we have absolutely no control. So, the feeling of being the undead or the living dead or the walking dead it is a very pressing one, I think. So from Max Brooks's World War Z, which slightly predates the global financial crash, to things like The Walking Dead itself on television, to films like The Girl with All the Gifts. There's a lot of it. To the proliferation of zombie walks in cities, something I'm kind of interested in, to online adverts for zombie-proof homes, all these kinds of things. There's a real sense that the zombie apocalypse is upon us, because in some ways it kind of is, as a way of thinking about what's happening to the world. There's a famous quotation that's been ascribed to a number of different thinkers, to the effect that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Capitalism has suffered this enormous existential shock. It is as though the end of the world has happened. So all of these apocalyptic zombie narratives, that's another one. I'm expecting a wave of Donald Trump horrors, if we aren't there already, and I suspect they'll be of the King Kong Godzilla variety.
This is not a question, it's just to add on to that. I think another trend that I've noticed is tech horror. So Black Mirror-esque kind of shows. Ex Machina comes to mind. I think it's just people are freaking out about what's going on in terms of artificial intelligence and security on all sorts of things. So maybe that's relevant.
Yep, I mean, I'm a bit nervous to say this in front of you guys, but I think that this is absolutely right, and I think that the developments of the internet, which I'm of a generation that's too, I can't really go there. My daughter's generation understands this, but the developments of the internet, particularly of social media, within less than a generation, half a generation, incredibly quickly, has proven psychologically almost impossible to assimilate with the speed that it's happening, and that's my great concern. And it may destroy us all. I mean, we may be about to witness the end of democracy as a consequence of the fact that we cannot assimilate the implications of social media quickly enough at the speed at which it's happening. So I'm not surprised to see a swathe of techno horrors, and there's always mad science of various kinds has always been. There have always been anxieties about scientific advancements and discoveries, and as I said, it's the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein. And I think the link, the line from Frankenstein to Ex Machina is a very, very real one. And it's interesting that the Victor Frankenstein, the demiurge, the creator, the mad scientist of Ex Machina, is of course a search engine tech wizard.
I've also noticed in recent horror the trend to focus on human connection. Sometimes, like in Stranger Things and even The Haunting on Hill House, and there's this game, the Simulacra, that discourages use of social media by turning social media into a monster of sorts. Do you think this is like a general trend in society of encouraging genuine human connection, or is this an expression of our fear of disconnecting, or is this just something to encourage people to get into horror?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm having a middle-aged person's senior moment now. What was the name of the social media horror film that came out a few years ago? Anyway, Unfriended. Unfriended. That's the one. Yes. And one of the things that film, which in many ways is a very conventionally structured teens in peril sort of movie, that we've seen from Halloween to Final Destination, to I suppose even things like Ring, but with an online difference. One of the things that viewers and critics of a certain age asked of that film is, why not just turn the bloody internet off? Why not just don't disengage with social media? And clearly, one of the points that this has to make is of the impossibility of a meaningful life offline. That there's a whole generation for whom this is, you might as well say, stop breathing. And this is disturbing. But one of the things that it's also worth saying is that horror is a generational thing. And so each generation finds its own monsters, and each generation is rendered obsolete by the monsters of the next generation. So it may well be that in saying these things, what I'm saying is that this is no longer, I'm very comfortable talking about 1970s and 1980s horror because that's what I grew up with. It may well be that what I'm saying is I don't understand the modern world, and this is frightening to me because it means I'm obsolete and about to die.
Thanks for the talk. Given the strong connection between horror and culture, what do you think that makes a good movie that is scary everywhere? The Shining is
okay.
Scary. It doesn't matter if you're from anywhere. It's kind of good in any case.
I think the answer to this is in part a very old-fashioned answer. And it's there in the theory of classical drama. It's been there. It's the way we've understood art since we've had art to understand. The way we understand narrative is in the classical unities of time, of place, of action. Now, what this means for a film like The Shining is one location, one series of events, one winter at least. There are films like Wreck, the Spanish zombie movie, which narrows it down even further. One apartment building in Barcelona, one night, one attack of zombification or whatever it is. So that a concentration on the effective, tried and tested narrative forms works really well. And there's a reason why these narratives and these ways of telling a story have survived through centuries and millennia, and it's because they work. The building of an unsettling atmosphere is genuinely important. There's a debate amongst practitioners of horror as to how much should you show, and whether that which is truly horrifying is that which we create in our own imaginations, or that which the screen shows us. And at different times, there have been different answers to that. So that with technological advancements, sometimes horror tends to get more spectacularly gory. You want somebody reaching down their throat and turning themselves inside out. You could probably do that now. You couldn't do that 2 generations ago, at least. So these kinds of things. So there's a debate going on as to how much we should show, what's most effective, but my feeling about it is, and maybe I tend to be kind of old-fashioned in this, is that the things that work, we've known that they work for centuries and millennia. We update them, we modify them. So that's the answer, I think.
Thank you very much, Darryl Jones.